This is How to Reach the West Again, a podcast that explores what it will take to have a fresh missionary encounter with Western culture. I'm your host, Brandon O'Brien. Our time together each week begins with an explanation from Tim Keller about one of 6 essential elements of a missionary encounter. Next come conversations with scholars and practitioners of various sorts who study these things and put them into practice in diverse contexts throughout Europe and North America. How do we explain Jesus to people who view the church as woefully irrelevant at best and harmful at worst? That's the question we're exploring in this episode. Tim Keller begins by outlining the elements of a post-Christian evangelism dynamic that moves beyond traditional evangelistic methods. This work, he concludes, will be the work of ordinary Christians through personal relationships, supported by churches that create a variety of spaces for preaching, teaching, and dialogue. Our 2 guests illustrate what these efforts can look like. René Bruel, a pastor in Rome, gives us great examples of how his church attracts non-Christians through fellowship and friendship that demonstrates the power of the gospel when people run up against the limitations of the cultural narratives they live by. Next, Lisa Fields, an apologist and founder of the Jude 3 Project, explains how she equips churches to address the unique apologetic questions raised by Christians of African descent. First, here's Tim Keller.
A truly post-Christendom evangelistic dynamic. Western churches have many evangelistic methods and programs, but, as we saw above, they all assumed that there were still non-Christians in society who would seek out the church, or at least be open to an invitation to come, and who held basic concepts of God, truth, sin, and an afterlife, and who thought that even if they did not believe, religion was a positive good for many people. For 1,000 years, the Western Church's basic ministry model was premised on the social reality that people would be coming, prepared, and positive, and we could simply preach our sound biblical sermons to them. Increasingly, this is not the case. If it is true that more and more people lack any religious foundation, and that the dominant cultural narratives are making the Christian faith more offensive, then we must find new and compelling ways to share the gospel in this generation. In fact, we must discover a late modern version of the evangelistic dynamic of the early church, which grew through conversion in a similarly hostile and uncomprehending culture. The elements of such a dynamic include these. First, attention. How do we get people to pay attention to the gospel when they find it irrelevant? Michael Green estimates that 80% or more of evangelism in the early church was done not by ministers or evangelists, but by ordinary Christians explaining themselves to their oikos, their network of relatives and close associates. People paid attention to the gospel because someone they knew well, worked with, and perhaps loved, spoke to them about it. The greatest challenge today is to stimulate a significantly sized percentage of Christians to intentionally adopt missional living in their daily lives and relationships. As Alan Noble notes in Disruptive Witness, late modern people are more open to considering Christianity when reading or watching stories and narratives that witness to Christian insights, and during times of stress, difficulty, disappointment, or suffering. Why? All worldviews that are not biblically based are like a suit of clothes that are too small. Such clothes always uncomfortably pinch, and occasionally they actually rip. The late modern view of reality and the self does not fit human nature as God designed it. There are times in which stories and art reveal how today's beliefs pinch and fail to satisfy. There are other times, especially times of pain, that the late modern worldview rips and wholly fails to provide what is needed to face such experiences. Christians need to be prepared in these moments to give an answer to everyone who asks them to give a reason for the hope that they have. That's 1 Peter 3:15. This entire project assumes Christians will know enough about the Bible and their faith to engage in conversations with others. But it also assumes believers have many relationships with non-Christians. It assumes that the average Christian is in close proximity to non-Christians. When that isn't the case, the first and most important step is to focus on building personal relationships with non-Christians by befriending them and loving them since they are increasingly unlikely to go to church on their own. Second, attraction. Helping non-Christians recognize they have a problem that requires salvation will mean questioning people's answers even before the more traditional apologetic method of answering people's questions or objections about Christianity. Now, what I mean by people's answers is I mean the working answers to the big questions of life that everyone must have. No one can live life without meaning, satisfaction, freedom, identity, forgiveness given and received, without resolution of moral questions and hope for the future. The culture's ways to provide these things ultimately will not work. They will at least pinch and sometimes rip. And if we have people's attention, we can, at the opportune time, point to the unsurpassed resources of Christianity for each. Christianity gives us a meaning in life that suffering can't take away, but can even deepen, a satisfaction that isn't based on circumstances, a freedom that doesn't reduce community and relationships to thin transactions, an identity that isn't fragile or based on our performance or the exclusion of others. Christianity offers a way to both deal with guilt and forgive others without residual bitterness or shame, a basis for seeking justice that did not turn us into oppressors ourselves, a way to face not only the future, but death itself with poise and peace, an explanation for the senses of transcendent beauty and love we often experience. Put another way, we must help non-Christians see that their indelible needs and longings for these things are actually echoes of their need for God. Third, demonstration. There's a definite need to address the traditional objections to Christian faith. We must still answer people's questions. These objections may cluster around God. For example, people ask, how can a good God allow suffering? Or how can God send people to hell? Or they may cluster around the Bible, whether it's historically reliable or compatible with science. But today, non-Christians ask questions especially about the Church's historical record of injustice in regards to slavery, the oppression of women, the exclusion of gay and trans persons. These issues must be faced with a combination of humility and clarity, and also with a gentle insistence that doubters recognize the assumptions and moral judgments on which their objections rest, which themselves are leaps of faith. Fourth, conviction. We also have to explain the gospel in a way that is compelling and attracts late modern people. The gospel is, salvation comes from the Lord. That's Jonah chapter 2, verse 9. Gospel presentations, then, must always make 2 points. There's the bad news. You're trying to save yourself, but you can't. And there's the good news. You can be saved only through Christ alone, not your efforts. Now, in traditional culture, in which the basic narrative is the meaning of life is to be good, the bad news and good news look something like this. The bad news? You know you should be good, but you aren't good enough in your behavior, nor truly good at all when you look at the motives of your heart. For example, though you don't commit adultery, you have lust in your heart, Matthew 5:27-28. That's the bad news. And the good news? Jesus has taken the punishment your moral failures deserve, so that you can be permanently forgiven. In other words, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Romans 8:1. In late modern culture, however, in which the basic narrative is the meaning of life is to be free, the bad and good news may look more like this. The bad news? You want to be free, but you're not? You must live for something, and whatever it is will enslave you and lead you to exploit other people. The existential justification identity you seek is impossibly fragile and will lead you to exclude others. The deep satisfaction you seek is elusive and can't be found in this world. And the explanation for all this is that you were created for the true God. Your failure to live for Him is a violation of both obligation and love. So what's the good news? On the cross, Jesus reversed the power dynamics of the world, giving up power in service rather than exploiting, and He took the just penalty for our unjust rejection of God and treatment of others. This provides an identity unlike any other, one that provides unconditional love and is not based on the ups and downs of your performance. This identity creates a new freedom from being controlled by any force or object in the world, and also provides a foretaste and assured promise of deep satisfaction and beauty in the future. Now, all these elements of evangelism, attention, attraction, demonstration, conviction, will each need to be rethought in our time. Attention and attraction will be largely accomplished by Christians in their personal relationships, which we have said means that Christians must have deep relationships with non-Christians, and this must be done in a culture in which all face-to-face relationships are thinning out. Christian leaders also need to equip lay people with the tools and resources to have evangelistic and apologetic conversations. If these relationships are established, churches will then need to provide a great variety of venues in which people considering the faith can be helped through the stages of attraction, demonstration, and conviction. This can be done through talks, teaching, and preaching, through dialogues and conversations, through small groups and large gatherings, through worship, stories, and art.
Being in Rome, the main question people have when it comes to Christianity doesn't really center about God. For example, is there a God, or how can there be a good God if there is suffering? Or about the Bible, is it trustworthy, or is it oppressive, or does it exclude people? But it centers on the church, who the church is. People feel that the church is flawed and outdated, but it's the only church we know. We don't accept it, but it's ours.
René Bruel is the founding pastor of Hopera Church in Rome and author of The Paradox of Happiness. He also contributed a chapter to a city-to-city publication called Movements of the Gospel, which is a collection of reflections from pastors in Europe about evangelism in Europe's diverse cultural contexts. As René explains, the Roman Catholic Church presents unique apologetic challenges for young Italians.
For a couple of generations now, most Italians have detached from the church. They see some utility for it, almost like a public utility. Like it's good to have cemeteries when I die. It's good to have the church when I get married. But they don't see much of the relevance for them right now. And they see an outdated model when it comes to sexuality and how it plays out in the scandals of priests who abuse people or have double lives. And they don't see how it really speaks into their language, into their own problems nowadays. But it's the only option they know.
The conflicted relationship many young Italians have with the church creates something like an identity crisis in a culture that values belonging and connection.
Yes, I would say that here in Italy, there is a combination of the Western individualism that you find in other places, mixed with a sense of communal identity, a more collective approach to life that gives a lot of emphasis on relationships, on being part of a group, being part of your family, staying loyal to your hometown and home region. And so our approach in presenting the gospel to people, it tries to offer a sense of belonging as much as believing. It's not only presenting a set of doctrines for people to believe in, but I feel it's very important for them to see a community of people who believe. They see the relationships, how people relate to one another, how they love each other, how they deal with differences. And that makes a big part of the filling out the picture for them to acquire a new sense of identity, which is Christian, but which is embodied in a community they get to be part of.
So in terms of apologetics, René believes relationships are the best way to address concerns that the church is irrelevant or even immoral.
When it comes to the ambivalence people feel towards religion here in Rome, I think a lot of it doesn't happen in a spoken way, and more in an embodying a different way of being. A church which functions in a different way, in which they see, for example, younger people attending it. And I remember a person saying, church isn't just for old people and people down on their luck, or who are poor, or who are disabled. And they see a group of people who looks, in a sense, normal, who has a different liveliness to it, a different sense of love and joy in them. And a lot of it doesn't get really spoken, but then you embody it. And then people start asking questions like, why is that this thing that seems to happen in this way? And so they begin to ask questions. It's a beautiful thing because they're curious at the same time. They're puzzled. They don't have categories to deal with what they're encountering, right? At the same time, then they see the beauty of the church, people worshiping and people accepting them and loving them. And they almost go beyond the cognitive process in terms of explaining things and giving categories to things, but they're trying to embody a worshiping community, a witnessing community for people, and they get to see that, and they often get captivated by that.
To what degree do you see people kind of consciously recognizing the limitations of the frameworks that they have kind of inherited, either from a sort of nominal association with the church, kind of broader cultural expectations, or those secularizing kind of modern efforts to rebuild? What kinds of crises or conflicts do you see people reaching that might prompt them to look for a community like yours?
Yes, I do see people bumping into pressure points or conflicts or crises that open them to the gospel. Often it's a love crisis, so breakups, the end of a marriage, the death of a spouse, or waiting for someone who doesn't seem to be arriving, like a love interest. And often people feel very lonely, or they've been through relationships which started well, but then ended in a toxic way, and they're wondering, is it possible to build a healthy and lasting relationship? Then there are also emotional crises, which are hurts, people's anxiety, how to forgive or if to forgive. Negative thinking, negative emotions have been very prevalent during the pandemic. A very pervasive sense of loneliness. People are very lonely today. They have the attachment to the family here, but even so, they long to intimate relationships, a sense of belonging, almost to recover the belonging they felt as children, now as adults. A pressure point for them is the increasing demands of success the Western culture puts on people in terms of very increasingly unrealistic ambitions, like make it and become successful and going viral and all those kind of things. It's very high expectations. And this generation feels that the possibilities are lower compared to their parents in economic ways, or the job market, or half of the Italians, young Italians, still live with their parents. So it's a lot of high expectations on them, but lower possibilities, lower resources. And I think a final pressure point is the internet, which promises connection, but actually creates alienation. And people are feeling increasingly cynic about the online promise of connecting with communities, with tribes, with people, and they're trying to find solutions to those questions.
What ways have you found effective for helping those people then begin to see that the gospel might offer a solution to some of these crises or challenges they're facing?
Here in Rome, we try to offer a number of things, a number of possibilities or events where people might connect with church community some way. Some of them present the gospel in some way, some don't. Often they're very relational, like parties, like doing a 1970s party where people just came and danced and had a good time. Cultural events, like, for example, dialogues, inviting someone from another viewpoint. We've done debates with the Italian Union of Atheists, with the largest Buddhist group in Italy. Rome has the largest mosque in Europe, so we did a debate with them about how religion can be a force for peace in the world. So it was very interesting. And then when you bring two perspectives coming together, it makes it very compelling to them, more than maybe a talk in which someone presents one point of view. But all of that tries to establish relationships in a sense of community and belonging to a group. And what we try to do is to canalize that into a pathway. What we do here in Rome is a seeker groups, which is a series of evenings in which people come, we have pizza, and we share our stories about our own lives and examine the stories of Jesus in the gospel, how Jesus met people, or the stories that he shared, the parables. And often they get people talking, and they love a sense of a journey in a group together with people on the way who are seekers as well. And often they try to acquire curiosity and interest in faith out of that.
How do you understand the seam maybe between seeking and exploring and then being integrated into the broader community?
I think that here in Europe, people's paths towards faith often take longer. They have to maybe overcome greater doubts. They're less familiar. People's lives are complicated. That being said, in our case, the way we do seeker groups, we often try to be very clear and to invite people. And we often we come to a point in which we meet them one-on-one for dinner, a person or a couple, and then we hear their story again, ask if they have questions, explain the gospel again. So it becomes a very clear point in which someone decides to embrace the gospel and follow Jesus or not. in our case. Though there is some cases in which people maybe don't feel like doing that now, and they're part of a community, take longer, some come to faith eventually, and some don't.
We're obviously trying to move people into communion with Christ and communion with others in Christ. But I wonder where where you see participation along those various circles, and kind of when does discipleship begin? When does the journey kind of start? Is there some point in that, or is it all journey, all of it kind of part of that movement toward Christ?
To the extent that people attend social events, even hosted by the church or by people from the church, when do they cross the threshold and join the community, join the church? I found that this boundary is often quite blurry for a few people, in which they want to enjoy the community, but don't really want to believe or subscribe. We have, for example, people who come, even if to church services that you see they don't like them, they don't like it, but they want to be around and they want to have friends, right? And we see that our approach is to let them be. Invite them to try to take steps every now and then as they're ready, but then don't see too much of a problem if they're kind of around in a sense.
How do you prepare or equip your congregants to do the work of, connecting with their friends and neighbors and loved ones, coworkers, connecting them into these various points in the pathways and being able to answer some of the questions that we're talking about?
What we try to do, we try to encourage people to maintain a significant set of relationships, both acquaintances and close relationships, in which they spend time in nurturing those relationships, invite people for dinner, going out, trying to show love in a practical way, often in a costly way, building trust. We also celebrate people who are doing that. I think it's often that's the key, where we celebrate people who are making friendships or inviting people in some way, or a friend who invited a friend to come to church. Often what we celebrate ends up happening. And the way we celebrate baptisms here in our tradition, we baptize people as adults. And it's a very striking image for people in Rome to see an adult being baptized, not a baby. They only see babies. And we have people sharing their testimony, and they're very eloquent and powerful in their stories, how they their journey, how they found Christ, what Christ means to them. And then we do it at a lake and see an adult being baptized. So these moments of celebrating the beginning of Christian life often sparks curiosity in people, and they say, "Oh, what's this? What has this person found? Maybe there's something for me here as well."
What considerations do you make in your preaching, or are there particular strategies that you use in your preaching to try to connect with crises people are feeling that we talked about earlier, the sense of loneliness or disappointment in their career or other things? How do you use your preaching to kind of connect people to those broader cultural experiences and concerns?
I think preaching is it can be very powerful when we try to identify with people, even if you feel that they're going through very hard things, very strange things for us, to not talk to them as if you are going through that and that's bad, that's there's a stigma around it, but try to really put ourselves in their shoes and saying, oh, maybe some of us here are dealing with anxiety or think about a friendship which disintegrated, or a love relationship, and really try to put themselves in their shoes. And people feel like, oh, this person made the effort to feel what I'm feeling, and there's no stigma, even if there would be stigma in a church setting in a sense. So I think there's a very powerful, and when we acknowledge the different states people are at, and if people don't believe, or if they have doubts, or if they're not sure if they believe, and we acknowledge that, and it's no problem, people often feel included and they lean forward instead of taking a step back and not and feeling like, oh, I'm being here talked down to, I'm being judged, and I think this is often a big part of it.
Can you think of an example, recent or otherwise, from your church of someone who's kind of walked this journey from well outside the faith to just beginning to pay attention to Christianity, to the gospel, and then who kind of walked through this pathway we've been talking about to union with Christ. Can you give us an example of something like that?
Yes, I can share an example that happened in my own building and my own floor. It was started with a girl from Spain called Paula. She actually, someone first witnessed to her when she lived in Spain, in Valencia, and she was an atheist. At university, someone shared the gospel with her, and she became a Christian. She moved to Rome as a fresh Christian, moved here and joined our church. She started working for one of the UN's organizations, the Food and Agriculture Organization here in Rome. And she moved to the apartment just across mine in our building, where there lived an Italian woman and a French woman. And then she started sharing with them. And they were my neighbors. I used to greet them in the elevator, but didn't really take the conversation very far. Often just like, how's it going? Good, have a good day. But then Paolo started witnessing to them, and they started coming to church, the three of them together. And then as they came, they also started attending the secret group we have in our own home. And they often came with slippers just across the hall. And we had secret groups with them. And Paula, and then Mireille, and then Roberta, the three of them came to faith. It was a beautiful thing. One day I came off the elevator, and there was worshiping music from our church coming from their apartment. I said, "That's a beautiful picture. Like the fifth floor is covered, right, from our apartment and theirs. It's reached." And it was a beautiful way of seeing how people, one came from an atheist background. Mireille was French and had kind of melting pot of influence of yoga, and then maybe some esoteric things, and then Roberta from a traditional Catholic family. But then the three of them came to faith and coming to church together. I think it was one picture of what happened here, and would love to have happen all over Rome, other buildings, and all over the global cities of the world.
I asked Rene if he had stumbled into any particular surprises in ministry. His answer summarized nicely an important theme of our conversation: the value of being seen and feeling a sense of belonging.
One surprise we discovered here in Rome, is that often unofficial ministry counts more than official ministry. That is, people want to be invited for dinner. They want to be ministered around the table. If you invite them for a Bible study group or for a church event, or something that has a little bit of sense of being official or organized, it doesn't count. It counts if it is perceived as spontaneous. Oh, you're taking an interest in me, you invited me for dinner, and then we talk pretty much about the same things. But they feel like seen, invited, appreciated, not one in a group of many, but seen and appreciated for who they are and being invited as individuals.
We noted in a previous episode that none of us lives in the West generically. We all live in a particular place, like Rome, where features of Western culture, such as individualism, are clearly at work, but are modulated into a different key by local histories and social realities. But we can get even more specific and local still. Even within one particular place, there live different peoples and populations. The parts of the dominant Western narratives that pinch and rip for majority culture people may sit differently with minority culture people. I spoke with Lisa Fields to understand better in what ways the cultural narratives of the West pinch and rip for people of African descent. Lisa is a sought-after apologist and the founder of the Jude 3 Project, an organization that equips church leaders and lay people in apologetics. Our conversation had less to do with evangelizing secular people and more to do with addressing the concerns that drive young Christians away from the faith. This is a crucial ministry for churches as well, and one that lives along the seam of evangelism and discipleship. Lisa describes her work in this way.
We try to equip churches and lay people in apologetics. We do that through a number of ways, through podcasts, through conferences, through curriculum, online courses, and mini-series we have on social media, and our HBCU tour, Historically Black Colleges and University tour. So we're helping equip Christians to know what they believe and why in order to live it out and to be able to engage skeptics. And so we think the church is our primary service, because oftentimes when you're engaging skeptics, they'll be like, man, that's good. You know, we do forums on college campuses. Where can I go to church? And you want to point them to a church that's healthy enough to be able to handle questions, that are going to treat them with care, that are open to their questions. And not a lot of churches are ready for that. And so we have to help the church get ready for the skeptic.
You are specifically targeting those cultural issues, current issues, and intellectual struggles that face Black Christians specifically. What kinds of different or additional questions do you find yourself addressing a lot?
I think the most pressing one that we address that stands out is Christianity a white man's religion? And that takes the form of a number of different Black religions or Black cults, depending on how you would describe it, like Nation of Islam, Hebrew Israelism, Black Hebrew Israelites, Comedicism, Moors, all of these different kinds of groups. At the core, they're all saying Christianity is a white man's religion. Now, whether you go into Hebrew Israelism, where I think of it as more of a Jewish segment, or Nation of Islam, which is a more segment of Islam, you're gonna at the core, what they're saying is the same. That Christianity is a white man's religion, and they need to find a faith that validates their identity. And so that's one of the most pressing things that we deal with.
I want to stay there for just a second, because you've used a word that I think is really important to the big project that we're doing here when it comes to having a missionary engagement with Western culture. And one of the things that we talk about a lot being a challenge is the way people form and think about identities in modern culture. So I'm curious kind of like how the appeal of something like Nation of Islam in identity formation for someone who's questioning Christianity, how do those things relate to each other?
Identity was the first thing that the enemy used to lead people in deception in the garden. He said you could be as God. And he was playing on who they saw themselves as, their identity. In the same way, he doesn't have new tricks. He just recycles the old ones. And people are really, because their identity hasn't been affirmed, because of the history of Black people, particularly in the U.S., where we were known as 3/5 of a person, and constantly our identity we were less than, there were different creation narratives even given to us. When slave owners would give slaves the Bible, they would tell them that they weren't a part of the creation narrative, that they had a second account of creation. So historically, our identity in America hasn't been affirmed. And so and a part of that, way in which people didn't affirm our humanity, they used the Bible to do it. And so they were using pieces of the Bible, not the whole Bible, and to pick and choose things like the curse of Ham or things like that. And so because of that, people look for a faith that's going to affirm them, that's going to say that they are human, to give them identity. And if people don't treat you like you're human, you don't want their faith.
So geographically, Black Americans are part of the West, but their relationship and experience within the Western story is unique. So I'm curious how you would describe the relationship between people of African descent in the U.S. or abroad to the sort of bigger story of the Western world.
Yeah, I think it's a very complicated relationship. One, because we were kidnapped and brought over here as slaves, against our will, and so that creates obviously conflict between this dominant West culture, and it creates conflict between how we view the faith of those who have the dominant culture.
Part of the way we think about the missionary encounter with the West is addressing some of these cultural narratives that modern secular culture has been trying to shape us to conform to. We've become pretty familiar, I think, with the narratives that relate to kind of majority Western culture. Are there particular narratives among Black Americans, for example, that create different apologetic questions or evangelistic obstacles?
You know, I had a student at a historically Black college and university come to me and wanted to know, like, did God even care about injustice? Because of the ways he's seen forgiveness preached. And he thought the concept of forgiveness, the way he had heard it, would be a way in which people can kind of scapegoat justice. So he was really struggling with the faith because of that. Like, should I trust a God who doesn't care about injustice? He just wants me to forgive those who do wrong. And it's like, that's a part of the apologetic we have to wrestle with. God does care about injustice, so much so that he sent his son to die. But that doesn't negate the fact that we are to fight for justice on earth. You know, you can't read the Old Testament without stumbling upon passage about how God cares about those who have been treated unjustly. Proverbs is full of proverbs that tell about God's heart for those who have been treated unjustly. And so I think it is a poor reading sometimes in the West to glaze over how God feels about injustice. And so that's one of another major apologetic question that is pressing in the African American community. And there are young people leaving the church and going to different groups that I feel are very problematic because they don't hear the church addressing these things.
Are you seeing that exodus from historically Black churches, from predominantly white churches, or both? Or what's the situation that you're witnessing in that sense?
Yes, everywhere. There's definitely people across the spectrum, young people leaving churches.
It may come as a surprise to hear that there are young Black Christians leaving historically Black churches because they're not addressing these issues, when I might have assumed that Black churches have been addressing these issues for a while. So can you maybe give me some context on that? Why are millennial and Gen Z Christians not hearing what they need to hear in the churches that they're growing up in?
Yeah, so many of these groups they've been around. Like Hebrew Israelism has been around for years. It's picked up momentum because of social media. Comedic science, African spirituality, it's picked up momentum because of social media. And so it's moving and evolving at such a rapid pace because of technology that many historic Black churches haven't got caught up to speed on the questions that young people are really even asking. And that's why us equipping the church is so important. We want to help them stop the bleeding, but many of them don't even have any context for the question. Because they're like, I could tell you about, pictures of white Jesus and stuff broader, but when you go deep into the weeds of these doctrinal things that these other groups are talking about, they're just like not aware of it.
One of the things I find really interesting about the appeal of those movements is that they are trying to root contemporary Black identity in something ancient, something historic, and even geographically trying to help a population who has lost connection with their place of origin. Is there a way to leverage that impulse of trying to be rooted in something in the evangelistic work, apologetic work that you're doing?
Yeah. It's funny because I think, as you were saying, a lot of Americans' majority culture are so like tethered to American identity that they don't care about necessarily whether they're Scottish or whatever part of Europe, because they've been so tethered to American identity. But for them, the American identity is a quote unquote success story for majority culture. But for many African Americans, it hasn't been that same success story. And because it seems like a place where, for many, majority culture thrives and minority culture doesn't thrive. Many African Americans want to tether themselves to our identity where there's power, prominence, prosperity, all the things that the quote unquote American dream promises for the majority culture. Many minorities are seeking that, something to connect themselves to for their culture. Even now, Ancestry.com and all these things are big things. So anybody could trace their history for the most part, or their family tree, but it's not so simple for African Americans. I think understanding that helps give a little bit of empathy to those who are reaching to know, hey, people want to connect. And I mean, biblically, you see that your genealogy is so important. You know, many books of the Bible start with genealogies or have long genealogies because ancestry and history mattered. And if it was so significant for it to be documented in the scripture, how much more does the human heart want to be connected or know their history?
So one of the initiatives that I find really interesting that Jude 3 Project does is the HBCU tour. Evangelicals often think of universities as the places that people go to lose their faith. And so I think it's really great that you're targeting that context with these apologetic conversations. So can you tell us, kind of paint a picture for us of what that tour looks like and what you're trying to accomplish in the HBCU tours?
Yeah, so our HBCU tour is and for those who don't know, it's historically Black colleges and universities. We seek to answer the question, is Christianity a white man's religion? We kept hearing from Black students, hey, I have friends walking away because of this. Can y'all help? So it was like the majority culture at HBCU is African American students. So we're definitely going to meet our target there. And we just have forums, and our forums are very interactive. They include media, discussion, Q&A. And so we start 20 minutes with a session called Talkback. We give 10 students 2 minutes apiece the opportunity to come to the mics in the audience to tell us what they've heard about Christianity being a white man's religion. And once you get one student, everybody wants to come up, but you have to cut it off at 10. And then we play viral videos that kind of hold up this narrative that Christianity white man religion. One we played, the first one is from a guy named Brother Polite, who says Christianity has always been forced on Africans. And then we have a church history professor named Vince Bantu, and he does 20 minutes of the history of Christianity in Africa, starting from the first century up to, I think, 5th century. And then we go to slavery in America. So we play a clip from Nat Turner, which he talks about slave masters using scripture, using Black preachers to preach scripture about slaves submit to your masters. And we talk about how slavery has been, the Bible was misused in slavery. We have usually a pastor or influencer come do that. And then the third, we have a clip of a gentleman who says that the Black church only takes from the community, they don't give to the community. I talked about the impact of the Black church, and then after that, they students love it because we're not just lecturing at them. We're playing videos that they've seen on YouTube that have been viral. They're responding to them and not responding long, 15, 20 minutes. And then Q&A can last an hour or two, depending on how many questions, and they always have a lot of questions. And so and we go around to different HBCUs to do that.
Are there questions that come up, kind of frequently asked questions in those Q&A sessions that you hear a lot?
Yeah. Things about, images of white Jesus, images of Bible characters that are white. Why should we trust this? How can we trust this history? Things like that. But I'm very encouraged about the comments. Like, this is the first time I've heard this. I finally see myself in this faith. I was about to walk away, but this is helping me stay. Like, that really encourages me. It gives me this image of, In Jude it says pulling some from the fire, that we get a chance to pull many of these young people back as they're on their way out. We get a chance to help them see history as it is.
When I think of the questions that you just mentioned about images of white Jesus and white characters in the Bible and the sort of hidden history of Christian history in Africa and those kinds of things, it occurs to me that it's probably not the broader culture that are giving people the wrong idea about white Jesus and the history of Christianity in Africa and those things. It's churches that have given people the wrong idea. It sounds like for the work that you're doing, the church is one of those apologetic issues.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Do you feel that the broader kind of cultural conversations about secularism and those things are they in the front or are they in the back in the conversations that you're having? Like are secular narratives about what it means to be a person, are they driving the conversation or are they in the background?
They're in the background. It's funny because we just did a mini series called From People to Person, and I flew in a girl who's in comedic science, African spirituality, walked away from the church, and a guy who identifies as Hebrew, and we sat down for conversation. And it wasn't a debate. I didn't challenge them on any of their beliefs. I just wanted to hear how they got there. And it was funny because as I listened to the girl specifically, her main issue was the church. The reason she got to African spirituality was the church. And as we talked over dinner, because, we went to dinner, car ride, all of that after we did the on-camera stuff. And it was just interesting to hear. I said, have you ever seen a Christian practice what they preach? And she said, no. And she said, one of the reasons I went to the African spirituality committee, because I finally saw people who at least lived what they preached. And that was the most appealing. So I was like, so it's not knowledge that's the most pressing thing for you, is it? It's experience. And she said, yeah. And I think that's what people miss. Sometimes apologists miss, that sometimes you could go back and forth arguing with people and wrestle them down about an idea and say you won, you beat their point. But if their problem with Christianity is how Christians treat them and their experience with Christians and what they've seen Christians do in the name of God, there's no argument that you can make to convert them outside of how you treat them, how you live before them, and how you love them. And I think that's just something we have to wrestle with, that it's not just about information, it's about application.
What advice would you give to pastors listening to this conversation about creating space for listening to people who have had these kinds of experiences?
Yeah, I think it's simple. The answer's in the question. Just create space and listen. Just invite people that have left the church, invite people who've left the faith to come into your space and say, hey, share your story with me. How did you get here? What led you to down this path? And just be quiet and look them in their eye as they're talking and listen. And that's so difficult for Christians, because as soon as they hear a point that's doctrinally off, or as soon as they hear something heretical, or as soon as they hear something that they disagree with, they feel like they have to correct them at that moment. And I tell people to think about it. Like, God is amazing to me. One of the most amazing things to me about God, especially in prayer, he lets us question his character. He lets us say all kinds of frustrating things about who he is, when he's demonstrated over and over again that he's exactly who he said he was within scripture. But he comes and lets us bring all of that to him, all our frustrations, all the fact that we don't think that he cares about us, all of that in prayer. And he's just there. And he doesn't say anything until he feels like he needs to say something. That's so comforting that we have someone that will let us cast our cares, our frustrations on him. And that is so comforting. And I think that if that's comforting to us, why can't we give that gift to others?
We want to be prepared to give an answer. We want to have an answer. but every moment is not the right moment to deliver an answer.
Yeah, and 1 Peter 3:15 says, give an answer to anyone that asks. When you're listening, people are just venting. They're not asking questions. So they're not asking you to make an objection while they're venting. If they ask you a question about the sovereignty of God or authority of Scripture, yes, be prepared to answer that. But when they're venting about their frustration with the church or what they've seen or why they went to another faith, they're not asking a question. And I always tell people, when you listen to people and you hear them, they will listen and hear you because they feel respected and they feel honored. And so when it's your turn to talk, when they invite you into the conversation, they're going to be more prone because you listen to them. We did a roundtable discussion with 4 young adults who left the church called Why Don't Go. They told me this was the first time somebody listened to them from the church. And I'm like, this shouldn't be the first time that somebody listened to you voice these complaints. And so I think we just have to do better about being able to just say, you know what? I'm going to listen to you. And it may offend me, but I'm willing to be offended because God is not offended in prayer when I bring things to him.
What advice would you give pastors, church leaders who are trying to be more sensitive to the sort of particular questions people are asking where they are, and create space for good dialogue?
I think one of the most helpful things and underutilized things that churches do is anonymous surveys. When we did an apologetics class in my dad's church, my dad told me he wanted me to teach one, and I said, I want to do a survey first. I want to do an anonymous survey to see where people at, to see what our doctrinal beliefs are versus what people actually believe. Because one of the things pastors don't realize is that usually people don't come to church for preaching. They come for worship. They come for children's ministry, community. If that's the last thing, it may be some disconnect between what's being communicated from the pulpit and what the people actually believe. And oftentimes they're not going to tell the pastor directly what they believe. So you have to create a space where they feel safe enough so you could gauge where they are. Because there's a tremendous gap oftentimes between the pew and the pulpit. And so I think an anonymous survey will help you gauge where people are, give them the openness to leave their questions or, send their questions somewhere on a Google form it's not connected to an email, that they could submit questions and then go through it with your leadership team to see a systematized way where you could start answering some of these questions and start seeing the needs or where people are. They may have been in church all their life and don't know how to study the Bible. Or they may be really struggling with justice, but they're not going to necessarily feel comfortable to tell you that directly. So you create avenues where they could say it anonymously until they build up the courage to come directly to you. So I think those are some helpful next steps.
We've been toggling in this series between the universal and the particular, from meta-level cultural trends and transitions to specific cultural contexts. Our focus this week has been even more granular. Renee and Lisa have encouraged us to think at the level of individuals who are part of communities and histories and changing contexts, to be sure, but individuals too with personal hopes and hurts. If you're listening to this on a walk or during a commute, I hope you'll take a few moments of silence to think about people near you who are hungry for informal ministry around the dinner table, where they can tell their stories to someone who's eager to listen. And come back next week. We have Sam Alberry and Ephraim Smith unpacking what it looks like for Christians to be committed to a category-defying social vision, especially as that pertains to our sexual ethics and our commitment to racial reconciliation and multi-ethnic ministry. How to Reach the West Again is a production of Redeemer City to City. It is written and hosted by Brandon O'Brien. Just about everything else is done by Braden Gregg. Special thanks to Roosevelt Community Church in Phoenix, Arizona for their generous use of studio space. And to learn more about Redeemer City to City, visit us at redeemercitytocity.com.